am Dr. Len Sorotsky, and right now you're with me to hear a story about World War I. World War I, almost the entire war, was right here in Europe, a pretty small place when you look at the size of the whole world. And added to that, I'd like to show you the first slide. Here is a list of all the wars that Europe was involved in between 1800, Napoleon, and 1914, World War I. And if you counted them up, you'd see there are just about 70 different wars in that same little patch of land. And then very quickly, I'm going to show you 3 different maps of Europe. And I don't want you to try to remember them or anything like that. But what I want you to do is to take a look at the map. This is a map from 1800 in Europe. And that's when France was doing very well. There was no Germany. There was no Italy in this time. And then we jump ahead to 1871 and we look at this map. Germany was founded by that time. And notice, if you would, look at Germany, and it almost looks like the head of a wolf with its mouth open right over where Yugoslavia is going to be. It's probably also important to see how the Ottoman Empire comes up from the Middle East into Europe and then clashes with the Anglo-Saxon Empire. The last map in this series of maps is a map of Europe in 1814, just before war broke out. And if you look at the map, you'll see that Europe is kind of divided into Central Europe around Germany, and the green countries are the ones that were going to fight Germany or anybody else as far as that goes. And so that's what we're going to talk about. Now, I want to show you a picture from Puck magazine. It was a very popular magazine in its day, and it shows some of the war members sitting down at a table, and they are playing cards, so to speak, with Navy ships. And the ships that they were playing with were dreadnoughts. That's what they were called. And they were enormously large ships, bigger than battleships. This was a battleship, or a dreadnought rather, that belonged to the United States in 1906. And every country had them. And so, as it said in Puck magazine, we're all trying to build the biggest dreadnoughts in the world. Everything was going okay until 1914. Bang, assassination. And this is really a freaky thing, if ever. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, he was the heir apparent to the Austrian Empire, as with his wife Sophie. It was the 28th of June, 1914. A mentally wounded guy named Gavrilo Princip was the guy who shot both Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie. And that was a freakish event, because when the list of cars came through, someone threw a bomb at Franz Duke Ferdinand's car, but it bounced off the folded top of his convertible automobile, and it bounced into the street and blew up underneath the car behind. Well, that took care of it. Everybody split and took off. And then the Archduke wanted to go to City Hall. He had an appointment there. And from there, he wanted to go to the hospital to see how everybody had made out. And the driver took a wrong street. And so the Archduke said, "Stop." And he did. And where did he stop? Right in front of Gavrilo Princip's, where he was standing on the corner. And with his pistol, he whipped out his pistol and he shot Archduke and his wife. And then the Princeps had 6 siblings, and each one of them died at birth. So he was the 7th, but he was 19 years old. And the law of the land said you can't give a death penalty to anyone who is not an adult. And at 19, you're not yet an adult. So he spent a few years in jail, and then he died of tuberculosis. 1 month later, exactly and to the day, World War I broke out. Now, one of the tricky things about World War I were the various alignments between countries, and many of them were secret alignments. But when the war broke out, Austria-Hungary declared war on Sarajevo, and they went at it. And then the Germans were on the side of Austria-Hungary. The Italians were, but they didn't come in until a little later. And on the other side, we have essentially France, England, and Russia. And you can imagine something of a population set-off that really did work against the Germans. But World War I was a very bloody war. And we know it as a trench war. And the reason for that is because there was nowhere to go. They kind of look back and they didn't know about all of these, the new inventions and new things that were coming into the war. And so the Germans wanted to invade France and go to Paris. And they thought that'd be the end of the war. But they came out, and the French came out, and they stopped them. And there they were with nowhere to go. So what do you do when you've got nowhere to go, but you're in war? So what they did first was to just dig little ditches like this, and you just lay in them and kind of hide. But by the end of 1914, and remember this is April 1914, June and July of 1914, there were 475 miles of trenches, and neither side could move. A typical trench was 10 feet deep, and it had a step inside on the out wall, and so that you could step up and shoot if you dare. But there was lots of time of just sitting there, and so here's an example of what to do at the time. A French barber has a long period of time, so that's where they have to sit and try to figure out what the heck are we going to do in this war? Who's going to win? And they also had to eat in their trenches. And this is a French distribution of food, not difficult at all. And they generally, France and England had pretty good food because a lot of it came from America. And the German trench was about the same. In between battles, they would lay down and sleep or do whatever they wanted to, just to take it easy and wait to see if the other side's going to charge them. And suddenly somebody would say, over the top, and there they would go. And they may get some far, maybe not. Now, one of the strangest things about World War I think is a fantastic story. In December of that year, just 5 months later, the Germans decided to call an armistice. And so the British and French joined them, and all of them got out and they played games and they gave gifts to one another, and mostly they sang. And the song that the Germans started with was Silent Night, which was originally written in German. And the songs were so plentiful. You might recognize some of these. It's a long, long way to Tipperary. Pack up your troubles in your old hip bag till the clouds roll by. Goodbye, Broadway. Hello, France. Until we meet again. Now, when the men were laying in the trenches, not many guys got killed. You know, it'd just be a lucky thing if somebody popped up their head and somebody shot. That happened. But mostly what happened, and the newest technology that no one understood, really, were these modern cannon. This is a 15-inch howitzer, and this is in 1917, so the war had been going on for a while. But in the spring of 1918, the Germans moved to within 75 miles of Paris, 75 miles. And with their long cannon, they fired 183 shells across Paris. And they called that a national holiday. When the shells would hit a trench, it would look something like this. So those guys never even got out to fight. They were just standing inside their trenches, you know, maybe singing. Singing was a big deal, and doing anything, and then the shell takes them out. And it didn't matter on whose side we're looking. It was always the same. The big guns destroyed the trenches. And so then you'd have to build new trenches. Pretty soon you got trenches next to trenches. And sometimes you even found yourself in the wrong trench. This is the Germans loading that airship with gas bombs. Gas was never used like it was used at the level it was in World War I. And this picture looks very hard to see. But take a look at it, and this is a row of trees right here. And right here, all along here, you can see every canister of poison gas. And the wind is blowing that way. And so that's what the Germans wanted, of course. And would be to set up these canisters or drop them from the air and let it blow on the Allies. But on occasion, the wind would shift suddenly and the gas would blow back on the Germans. And so that did happen. But there were like 90,000 men killed by gas during World War I. And here you see that horses were still thought to be a part of the war because that's what they always were. And so these horses in World War I had to have gas masks. And this is an example of a horse wearing a gas mask. And here are machine gunners. These happen to be machine gunners from Poland. And they're on a machine gun, but they're wearing gas masks. And here's another one. This is a British machine gun, and they're wearing their gas masks. And everyone did that. The Germans in this picture, there's a kind of a cool one here. They had their dogs in gas masks. So everybody was trying to protect every living thing with gas masks, and that went on all through the war. There were several different kinds of gas that were used. Chlorine, which was the weakest of the gases. Phosgene was another, and mustard. When mustard gas got men in the face, and if they didn't have a mask on, they went blind. Now, that blindness could last a lifetime, or if they were fortunate, they might only have to put up with a temporary blindness. The Sargent, John Singer Sargent, painted this picture, which sort of looks like this one, except they're going the other way, you know. But if you see this picture, the original picture by John Singer Sargent, it's much longer, includes many, many more men. One of the Germans had Austria-Hungary and Italy, but they also had the Ottoman Empire, and this was their flag. The Ottoman Empire was a very, very powerful force. At one time, they controlled just about half of Europe, and they had troops. At the end of the war, they were reduced to the country we know as Turkey today. And the leader of their group was a young man, Enver Pasha, and he took the Ottomans into World War I. And their biggest battle was consistently with Russia. And all of that fighting with Russia led to a revolution in Russia a little later on, and I'll tell you about that. This is the leader of Austria-Hungary. This is Franz Joseph the First. He was the emperor of Austria and the king of Hungary, plus a couple of other little places. But he was born in 1830, and so he passed away in 1916. But while he was in his role as king, he saw the king's role as the divine right, and that puts him in the place of God. And the one other leader that we should know about, just to mention, don't try to remember, but this is the king or Tsar Ferdinand of Bulgaria. They went into the war with Germany, stayed for a few months and decided, nah, this is too much, and so they got out. Italy, by the way, I mentioned to you that Italy started out with Germany, but it didn't take too long before Italy changed sides, and then they fought against Germany. It's tricky. I want to show you some of the European advertisements that were used. These are almost all from England, but they wanted men. They had to get men, and so they would simply say, step into your place. You're going to go. Everybody is going to go. And then the next one are the sportsmen. The sportsmen from every different kind of sport. And they wanted everybody to do their part. And they knew that they could ultimately win. A big change that occurred in World War I, and there had been women in the war before, but in World War I, these were the British WACs. And there were women in Europe, and there were American women in Europe, even at the time of the beginning of the war, and they were nurses. And lots of them did a great, great job. And the women of Britain said to their men, go, go. And later, they were a bit sorry because they lost a generation of young men. This one is from one of their leaders, Field Marshal Lord Kitchener. And he's trying to urge men, get in, let's go, men. And when they all did, and when the war was over, there were 750,000 men, or 9% of England's males had died. And they were just stretched out all these cemeteries all over. This was Australia's view of the world. And they saw the German Huns coming after them. And so they decided, boy, we better get in here too. And of course, Australia was a part of England, as it is today. And this is what they saw as a view of Australia if they didn't get involved. Canadians, same thing. The Canadians came over, here they are resting in a trench. But England had men come and serve from almost every country where they had large populations. The Canadians were there over the top, same as always. And here are some of the Australians with their gas masks on in 1917. And then here is a battle in a place called Vimy Ridge with the British soldiers going on to victory. And this one, you can see another Canadian ad on behalf of England saying, get in there and do something for the mother country. And so guys did. Now, I have to drop back just a little bit because the Japanese had a pretty big fleet, and they've always been sailors. And here is their fleet off the coast of China. Why is that? Because Germany had established a colony in China. And as soon as the war broke out, right after the war broke out, the Japanese said, to heck with this, we're not letting it go. And so they took off after the Germans in North China. And they even had aircraft. So they were pretty far advanced, probably farther advanced than anyone had realized until this time. And notice the bomb that this pilot is carrying right by his side. So the other group that you should know that got into the war almost immediately was China. Their people were called coolies. And this is a picture of them after they were getting some kind of uniform. But China had volunteered to send 300,000 laborers to England and France. And both countries turned that down at the beginning. They said, no, we can't. Well, we can't. But by the end of the war, it was clear how good the Chinese laborers made some things because many of them stayed in Europe after the war was all over. China wanted to work. They weren't fighters, but nevertheless, they lost 10,000 men. And this is another picture of the Chinese who I said that they had offered 300,000 in the beginning of the war, by the end of the war, towards the end of the war, 1917, the British chose 100,000 and the French chose 40,000. And they helped out an awful lot. And here they are working in France in 1917. And this picture shows them loading, and that's what they wanted to do, load carts and trucks and so on. And you can see here how they want to load trains and everything. And they were brave men. Along with the Chinese and the Japanese in the war, the Indians were in the war. And these were soldiers of India. And India, of course, at that time was part of England. And so they saw nothing wrong with sending Indian troops to do their part and see if they could help the mother country win the war. And this is the last of the Indian group. Right here it shows they bicycles, horses, mules, all kinds of animals participated with them. Now, besides China and Japan, and by the way, China declared war on Germany towards the end of the war, 1917. Japan didn't declare war, but they did take over the German colony in China. They did manage that. Now, how about Latin America? This is a little little article that I found online. Online is where I went for almost all of these pictures and so on. This is a little article on Latin America. And I asked the question, did Latin America get into war? Well, Brazil did. And this article explains all of the fighting between and among the countries of Latin America. And the Germans, of course, had U-boats offshore, and they would sink Latin American ships also, as well as American ships and so on. So, but it's excuse me, it's a very good little article on Brazil. Now, the next thing that was new to the war was the strategy of using tanks. They were referred to as the battleships of land. The problem was they could only go at 4 miles an hour, no more than that. And the Brits and the French throughout the war produced 6,500 tanks. Yet by the end of the war, only 4 tanks remained. They were always stuck in the mud and so on, and people could overtake them. But every country that was involved, they all came up with it. This is a big German tank, and you can see the size of it by the number of men who were able to sit on top of that thing. And you wouldn't want one of these coming in your path if you could avoid it. And yet you couldn't destroy them with a rifle. I mean, you could shoot all the bullets you wanted, and that didn't matter at all. You'd have to trick that thing or bomb it or something you'd have to do to it to stop it for good. And people learned how to do that. One of the things that the tank could do was they were so big, now this happens to be a British tank, but they were so big that they could reach over any of the places where the soldiers were, you know, and of course, if you happened to be in there, you'd be in trouble. Here we see another thing that was quite new to world wars, and especially to World War I, the German airships. And it takes a whole bunch of guys to bring an airship down, or even to let it go up. And when it goes rockety, whoa, it can throw guys all over. I was at Lakers, New Jersey for a couple of years, and while I was there, we were the home for American airships, and we had one day, all of the airships were parked outside of their shelters, and a tornado came through and whapped up 4 of them, I think. And that captain came over, he yelled at us, I was a weatherman, and he yelled at us because we didn't know that that tornado was coming. And then our leader tried to respond to him. Every country had aircraft. This is a French aircraft. And you'll remember that flying in the air just a few years before World War I started, 1914 and 1903, was probably one of the first times that we had an aircraft at all. And there were certain advantages to aircraft. It was hard to hide from them. And they could fly so far. And this is a German plane flying in Egypt, to give you the example of the distances that they could cover. And of course, once you see an aircraft above you, you know he's going to shoot you with his pistol, or he's going to throw a bomb on top of you. So it was kind of spooky. And this is a German hydroplane. Great advantages there to be able to send a plane up from water to water, and so on. But it's a great advantage when you've got hydroplanes. And this is another German plane, a fighter plane. Whoa. And the Germans loved this aircraft. It's a very good one. And here is an Australian aircraft being launched from a ship at sea. Now that's a heck of a thing to do. And this is World War I, and the Australians somehow had figured out how to do that. And then the last one is this is a Serbian aircraft. And all of these planes, they almost always carried a bomb, and the pilots carried pistols. But by the end of the First World War, in fact, it was a couple of years before the end, the Germans had invented a way to shoot a machine gun through the propeller. And so that was available to anybody. Anybody could capture a German plane and figure out how they did it. So, but anyway, aircraft were quite a thing. Now, while World War I was going on, Russia was fighting like crazy. And this message from them says, we have no bread. And the people were starving. And the Russian leader was with his troops in battle. And so we have a revolution beginning in Russia that has come to mean quite a bit to us today. This is Nicholas II of Russia and George V of England in 1913. They almost look like twins, don't they? They were related, and when there was kingship in the world, it was pretty common that one king would be related to another king, cousins or, uncles and stuff like that. And here again shows that. This is Wilhelm II of Germany and Nicholas II of Russia. And only this picture is from 1905. Nicholas II had a pretty hard time of things as they went. He was a pretty good king, and here he is with most of his family. Right next to him is his son, one son, and he had 4 daughters. And then, of course, his wife. But Alexei was going to be the next Tsar and never quite made it. And here are the Russian girls: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. When the family was murdered, there was great hope and many, many thoughts that somebody got out of there alive. And the one who was thought of to get out alive was Anastasia. Maybe because Anastasia was the favorite child of Nicholas II. And he loved her so much. He loved all of his kids, but Alexei had health problems, really, really severe health problems. And his problems caused Nicholas and his family to fall in love with Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a wandering peasant. He had powerful influences over Nicholas and his wife. He was a self-proclaimed holy man. He was born in Siberia around 1869, and he had special healing abilities that no one has ever understood. And he worked on Alexei, and Alexei used to bleed for different unknown reasons, and nothing could stop that bleeding except Rasputin. And in 1916, the revolutionaries got a hold of him in St. Petersburg. They poisoned him. They shot him 3 times. They beat him and drowned him and buried him in a secret place. So he was lost. And then the family was all next. All of the Romanov children. Here they are. And I think one's missing from here. But Alexei, the young man, was only 14 years old at this time. They were taken to a little town called Yekaterinburg, a little town 900 miles east of Moscow. A grave of 9 was found in 1981. But the farmer who found it didn't want to tell the communists because he was afraid to tell them what they might do to the bodies, since they were responsible for killing them in the first place. 2 bodies were missing, but they were soon found in a burn pit. And after tracing, and the Americans were involved in that, Alexei and his sister Maria were the ones to be found in the burn pit. The entire family was finally taken care of and put into a church on July 17th, 1998, 80 years after they were murdered. When I saw their graves, I was absolutely shocked, because I didn't know anything about them finding their bodies and so on. I just assumed they were all killed and mysteriously buried. Well, finally, it's 1917, and the Americans are arguing, we have to feed the French and the British and the Russians because that's one thing we can do. And the Germans, of course, would sink any ship that was bringing food to England. Any ship that they could get, they would do that. And here's another one from the U.S., little paper doll saying, "Get ready for war, guys. We're going to have to go." And everybody kind of thought that, but President Woodrow Wilson was re-elected in 1916 because he kept us out of the war. But then in 1917, I'll tell you in just a second, there were two things that happened that got us in. Here was another one, the call for women to serve. And women did serve. And I think I mentioned to you that there were a number of American nurses who volunteered to work in France to help do whatever they could before we got into the war. One of the biggest things that affected us was this ship, Lusitania, a very, very big ship. The Germans fired one torpedo at it. It hit, but then there was a second explosion, and it was discovered that the Lusitania not only carried the passengers, but it also was carrying 4,200 cases of small arms ammunition. It sank in 18 minutes. 1,153 passengers and crew drowned, and among those were 128 American. So that was kind of hard for Americans to take, but the Germans wrote a telegram to President Wilson, and they said there would be no more sink on sight of ships. They wouldn't do that anymore. They were going to stop it, and they did from September 18th, 1915 until February 1st of 1917. And then they announced that they were going to just sink everybody once again. The Irish here's what they said: do you want to go or do you want me to go? One of us got to go. And they did. And of course, it wasn't many years after World War I that the Irish got in a war with England. The second factor that caused us to get into the war was what was known as the Great Temptation, the Zimmermann telegram. The Zimmermann telegram was a coded message which was uncoded by the British. Once uncoded, the British told the Americans about it. And the Americans said, that's it, we got to do this. We have to get in there and get to war. This is Mr. Zimmermann, Arthur Zimmermann. He was the foreign minister of Germany. So he was involved in lots and lots of different kinds of things. The one American that I'm going to mention to you here, and I'll mention one more, but this is General John Joseph Pershing. His troops, and everyone, I think, everyone else knew him as Blackjack. During his lifetime, he was promoted to the rank of General of the Armies, the highest rank that any American could ever have. So on April 6th, 1917, we declared war, and Woodrow Wilson said in part that we must go to war to make the world safe for democracy. And he appointed he appointed Blackjack to be in charge of the troops. Well, the French and the English both said, well, if you Americans are coming over here to fight us, then you have to join one of our armies so that you know what you're doing. Blackjack said, if I'm coming over there, I'm coming over with the American Expeditionary Force, AEF, and we'll do what we want to do, and we'll run our own army. Whoa, pretty tough. The Americans did go, and when they first got there, first thing they did, sit in those trenches and study French, because that's where they were, and they had to learn something, so they learned French. One of the biggest, best-known fighting forces in the Army, and this is a freaky accident, the Harlem Hellfighters. It was an all-black unit, and they did fight, and they did fabulous things for America. And this one says, stop the ground stuff, get in the air, join the Air Force. We need men in the air. We need to build airplanes. We need to build men. We have to get pilots up there, and so on. And so we did. And perhaps the best pilot we had was this guy. His name was Eddie Rickenbacker. He shot down 22 planes and 4 balloons. Eddie was born in 1890, and he lived until July 23rd, 1973. He served as a race car driver after the war was all over, and then he became the head of Eastern Airlines, Eddie Rickenbacker. However, the Germans had a guy that you've probably heard of. This is the German air ace, Manfred von Richthofen. He was known as the Red Baron because he flew in a red plane. He shot down 80 aircraft before he was killed on April 21st, 1918. But the average life of a flyer was expected to be only a few weeks. This one, hold up your end. And these are the American nurses, once again, who did a fantastic job. And the reason for that, when we look back at wars, different wars in our past, without the medicines and the kind of treatment that we have today, so many guys would just lay there and die. And that's what happened in World War I also. So women not only worked as nurses, but here they are in a bomb factory. Little difference there. But these are women working on bombs. If you didn't want to work on bombs, you might want to work on munitions. And so these ladies are, I don't know what they're doing, but they're producing American bullets for our many, many different kinds of guns. And, with machine guns that could fire up to 500 bullets a minute. And even the rifles could fire 15 bullets per minute. That was pretty fast. Women were also called into the Marines, and they went over, and of course that's, now here we look at it today, this was kind of like the beginning where women went into war and fought in the war in virtually every phase of the war, and they're doing the same thing today. The Salvation Army was in World War I with handing out donuts to guys here, and they would provide music and stuff like that, and they were important. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about the greatest soldier that we had in World War I. He was Alvin York from Pell Mell, Tennessee. This was his certificate to get out of going to war. He said, I am a changed man. You know, when he was younger, he used to be fighting all the time, and he could clean up on everybody, but he was also a crack shot in all of the turkey matches. He'd click, bang, he'd fire. Well, but he said, more than that, I'm a member of the church, and my church will not allow me to fight. Well, the commanding officer said, they argued the Bible first for quite a while. And then his commanding officer said, okay, York, here's what I want you to do. You go home, talk to your God, and ask your God if there's some way that you can come back and help your country. So he did that, and he went back home, and if you go to Pell Mell, Tennessee, where he had his home, where he had everything, really, he's buried with his wife so that they can look from their graves up on this edge, just a little edge sticking out from a mountain. And he took his dog up there, and he went and talked to his God. And God said that it was okay for him to go to protect his country. And so Alvin York went in and did a fabulous, just when you think about what he did, there were a set of machine guns above him. And he was with a very small group of guys, and half of them were wiped out. And so there are only, like 7 guys left. And he said, oh, heck, I might as well go do something. So he wiggled across the open field, up a hill, and fired at the machine gunners. And the way he did that was to make the same click, the same kind of thing that he did with the turkey shoot. And every time a German would stick his head up to see what was making that noise, he would bang, and that would be the end of him. So he killed between 20 and 25 men, and took over the machine gun nests, took over the German office behind it, and he forced the German officers to resign their men. That was 132 men. And he had this little group of 7, or maybe 15. He started out with 13 men, but those guys were knocked out. And the German machine guns that he was up against looked like this. They were excellent machine guns, and they were the ones that were firing down on York. And he just picked off these guys one after another after another. No one else could have done that. No one. It was a fantastic job. He won the Purple Heart, the blue ribbon, blue ribbon, the Medal of Honor for what he had done. And when he was put up for that Medal of Honor, the officers checked, and everything, because they said there's no way anybody could do that. But the fact was, and this is a photo of the German officers being followed by their 132 prisoners. Many of the guys who welcomed him back first thought that he did that all by himself, and he said, no, there were other soldiers with me, and they did a lot of help. And at one point, I should tell you, when he was laying on the hill, 6 Germans took their bayonets and charged him. and his rifle was out of ammunition, so he whipped out his six-shooter and killed all 6 German soldiers. Unbelievable. One other unbelievable hero of World War I was Stubby. Stubby, no one knows for sure when he was born, maybe 1916 or 17, and he died in 1926. He was picked up by a guy who served in the 102nd Regiment and brought overseas and became the mascot of that whole troop. He would warn, he was in 17 separate battles, but he would warn the soldiers when artillery was fired. And one time he captured a German spy and held him by the back of his pants until he had help from some other soldiers. So when he was wounded a couple of times, but he made it home. And then when he did get back to America, he became the mascot for the Georgetown Hoya football team. And at halftime in football games, he would take the football and run around the infield, and people absolutely loved it. So that's Stubby, and you don't want to forget him. Okay, November 11th at 11 a.m., the men in charge took this train to a spot that was 37 miles north of Paris. And this is an armistice. It's not the peace treaty, that comes a year later. But this was the armistice that ended the shooting and so on in the war. And the men went into the train and they signed their signatures to the armistice. 11-11-11. And we just celebrated 100 years of the armistice being signed. When it came time to sign the peace treaty, President of the United States, right there you can see him, Woodrow Wilson, attended. He really wanted to play a big role, and he had, before, when America was still free, he was writing letters and things and everything, and he was looked at as a leader. And so he was there. And this picture, I apologize for showing you this picture, but there he is again, right there, signing the peace treaty in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles in 1919, June 28th. And it took power on January 10th, 1920. And that was the official end of World War I. But I said I'm sorry to show you this picture because it's just a little clippy picture out of this. This is the full set of men who came representing every country there was, just about everyone who was involved in World War I. They all wanted to have something to say and something to talk about. Wilson said there should be 14 points and we should live by these points and so on. And everything looked great, but when he got home, the United States Congress disapproved of the whole thing. So we never really got into it. And of all the men who went into the war, and they came from every state, of course, and there were 4 million who went to the war, and out of that there were 42,000, a little more than 42,000 that came from Florida. And this plaque was next to the hospital in what became the veteran site in the 1930s. And it's been, the men's signs and so on have been chopped up, a lot of them, and kind of destroyed. Then in mid-1918, boy, this was a freaky one. Mid-1918, just about when the war is going to end, Spanish flu struck across Europe and killed 25 million people. The feelings were just never so hot. Almost everybody blamed Germany for that, and nobody knows why, but it didn't matter. So that takes us to there. And I want to end, I'm going to have to hold this way in order to read In Flanders Field. Some of you probably know it already. And this was written by Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. And it goes like this. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly scarce heard among the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, we felt dawn, saw sunset glow. We loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrels with our foe. To you from failing hands we throw. We touch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. Freedom is not free. You all know that. I want to thank the men of METV for making this program possible, and I want to thank you, each and every member of our audience. Thank you. God bless you, everyone. Goodbye.